Tired of getting picked off by long ammo snipers while going from compound to compound? Unsure of how to approach a lair without being seen, or are you worried about not having enough cover on the way there? This pathing guide has information for both veteran players looking for an edge up, as well as newer players who are still learning the way around all of the maps. Good evening, or good day, it all depends, and welcome back to the ImpossibleIronman channel. This video will be the first in a series of pathing guides that will highlight the safest routes between each compound. There will be one video for each map, starting with Stillwater Bayou, leading up to the new map that will accompany the CryEngine update sometime in the near future. Hopefully. Before we get into it, here's a few things to keep in mind. Firstly, because I know someone is going to say it in the comments, you should play to have fun. I love using tactics personally, but if you have fun charging at things with a shotgun, then do that. View my pathing guide as a suggestion for what is optimal, not a requirement. While I will be sprinting most of the time in the video for the sake of the clip length, I recommend not doing so most of the time in actual gameplay. One of the most powerful things in Hunt is gaining information based on audio, and running is extremely loud. Walking when close to compounds or when passing through areas that frequently see action will do more for you than you think when it comes to not giving away your position. Lastly, remember that these routes are only suggestions. Make adjustments based on enemy positions, vanish locations, sound traps, etc. You may have to give up some safety to catch an escaping bounty token or to take advantage of a fight in progress. I've planned out and color-coded the routes on this map here. I've also made a key for it in the description, and the route titles in the video will match the color of the route on the map. I'm also launching a brand new Discord for my channel in which you can find and download this map. I'll be showcasing the more complex paths in the video. For the simple ones, however, I will return to this map and describe them so as to not make the video too long. With most of the pathing, you can travel in either direction with only one exception. That being option 1 for the route starting at Cypress and ending at Davant. As long as you follow the embankment, you will remain out of sight of the Davant compound unless a team is sitting at the edge of the tree line. Going from Davant towards Cypress, however, you will be exposed to anyone waiting at Cypress the entire way there, so I only recommend using this path the one way. While there are very few sightlines looking at this route, it doesn't offer much in the way of cover admittedly, and getting caught out on the embankment could be dangerous. If you startle birds or a horse while at Cypress, or you have a team following you from behind, I recommend using option 2 instead so you don't get ambushed from the forests south of Davant. This is the option I recommend using if you accidentally make too much noise while at Cypress. You might ask, if we're heading to Davant, why leave from the west side of the compound? Remember that the idea is to make sure other hunters can't establish a line of sight on you as you approach. If you startle a horse or birds while at Cypress, there will almost certainly be a team waiting for you at Davant, and they will expect you to use the embankment route. By using option 2, you can take a team lying in wait by surprise, or better yet, maybe catch them on the way to pitching if they get impatient. The most exposed part of this route will be this bridge right here, so keep an eye down the road and quickly cross back into cover. Be careful as you cross the road here, as there's often grunt and armored spawns in this tree line over here. Be sure not to startle them or at least take them out quietly. The swamp here offers decent protection, as it's covered with lots of foliage, and doesn't have very many common sightlines that look at it. People usually don't look down here either, unless they have a reason to. On the off chance you get caught out down here, the swamp offers decent cover, or you can always back off into the tree line to the right of this position. Using the same start as we did for the Cypress to Davant option 2 route, we will instead head to pitching. Now, as there are commonly water devils beneath this bridge over here, there is a Similar route you can take where you'll see a small sniper tower to the left of this position. I think you'll see it in the clip here briefly. You can head around that way instead should the water devils be beneath the bridge and achieve pretty much the same effect. This is just a bit more direct. Now, while you can head up to the compound at any point from this position, I'm showcasing how to follow the foliage all the way up, as occasionally, though it is rare, you'll get players that will camp behind the mounds over here leading up the hill. The route from Davant to pitching essentially combines the previous two routes and uses the theories from those to create a safe passage. Taking the main bridge between the two compounds is dangerous for obvious reasons, as any team coming from Slaughterhouse will be looking for players crossing between the two compounds at the bridge. And if you take the more direct route through the swamp, it doesn't offer you much in the way of cover on the off chance that you get caught out down there. You're pretty much screwed if someone finds you over there. So while this is more roundabout, there's less sightlines on it, and more places to back up into cover should you need to do so. Remember to simply head further down the embankment here if you need to, if there happens to be water devils under this bridge. You should be able to crouch under that first part of the bridge there and avoid aggro, and continue a little further down and then cross over there somewhere, should that be a concern. As always, be selective when choosing where to head up the hill into the compound from here, as there can be all sorts of different sound traps on this hill. There's frequently hives near the embankment, occasionally an immolator here near the corner of the compound, and sometimes some armoreds as well. And as always, a bunch of grunt spawns around this area. So, choose carefully. The pathing for Slaughterhouse to Stillwater is fairly straightforward. Simply head into the forest east of Slaughterhouse, or as the Impossible Iron crew likes to call it, Slaughterhouse, and then head north through said forest until you reach the Stillwater compound. That being said, there's a couple things to consider. Just left of, or west of this forest is the Healing Waters Church compound, in which there is a very large sniper tower. Generally speaking, you're going to want to keep some cover on your left side to prevent sightlines from that, as it can see most of the forest. If Catfish to the east of this position is active, however, or is the Banish, you'll want to keep some cover on more on your right side instead, to not only protect yourself from sightlines from the compound, but also teams in the surrounding area. So make adjustments as necessary. Now, while you can head up to the compound from this section of the forest approximately, relatively safely most of the time, for experienced players, it is a rather common route to take into the compound, and any team at the compound will be expecting you to come from this direction. So what I prefer to do for this route is to continue going through the forest and instead take the route that has the most cover leading up to Stillwater. You'll see what I mean here in a second, but it is by far the safest approach to the compound. I also wanted to quickly add in, while I finish showcasing this route, that if you have enjoyed the information in this guide so far, and or are looking forward to my pathing guides for the rest of the maps, I would appreciate it if you left a like on the video and subscribe to the channel if you're not already while you are here, as it helps my channel immensely. You can also ask me questions when I am live here on the channel, Mondays, Wednesdays, and Fridays at 8 p.m. MST. Everyone is welcome. This route is straightforward, but also risky, as it is a high-traffic area. Unfortunately, it's really the only path to take to these compounds with any cover, and experienced players know this. This makes it prone to getting camped, so I highly recommend taking a beetle to scout areas like this before running through them. I don't recommend using the swamp as an alternative, as long ammo snipers love picking people off in that area as they try to run from island to island with little cover. That being said, this crossing here over to Alice is actually a pretty safe route and one of the very few safe routes through water, as you can hop from rock to rock without movement penalty, and there aren't very many sightlines that actually look at that spot unless there's actively a fight happening in that general location. By using this path, we're avoiding a high traffic area of the forest directly in between Stillwater and the Chapel of Madonna Noire. This is actually one of the few routes where I think using a bridge is fairly low risk, but you can cross through the water should there be a nearby firefight. Players will often wait just south of Chapel for teams approaching from the bridge leading to Alice, or from the forest directly towards Stillwater. This approach allows us to go around all that while minimizing sightlines from the compound itself. Remember that high traffic area I mentioned just a second ago? This path unfortunately goes straight through it. That being said, I still think it's the safest path between Stillwater and Alice, as you're avoiding a lot of open ground by going this way. And if there does happen to be anybody in this forest, you'll be approaching from an angle most people won't expect. Keep your eyes peeled for spots like the top of that tree there, because believe it or not, people can actually sit up there. There's the whole saying, after all, that hunt players don't look up, and people like to take advantage of that. But tread lightly, and most people shouldn't detect you as you approach from that angle. This is a great area to scout ahead first with a beetle, usually before you pass the Chapel compound. Just clear that forest south of Chapel. Make sure that there are no players lying in wait before you proceed. I really cannot stress how underrated I think the beetles are in this game, as controlling information is very powerful in Hunt. Just make sure you fly the beetle high enough to where people can't hear it, or at least don't know where it's coming from, as being able to get from point A to point B safely will often mean the difference between you leaving with the bounty or your team getting the business, as we like to say. In other words, getting back to the lobby with nothing. For the beginning of the Chapel to Scupper route, I wanted to show you guys this cheeky little vault I found here in the corner of the Chapel compound. This allows you to head into the forest east of Chapel and make for a sneaky getaway from a spot that most players won't expect. Just be careful, as players do like to sit in the forest back there should Chapel be active or the banish, and there's occasionally a meathead spawn on that corner as well. Keep in mind at this spot here there's also occasionally an extraction. If there is, you will need to be wary of extraction campers in this area, but if not, it's almost always a safe path to go through. This clearing is probably the riskiest part of the route, as the compound does have some very small sight lines on it, but so long as you're careful you should be okay. And occasionally, on the other side of the clearing, there is an extraction, which can sometimes mean that players will cluster around this area. As always, it's helpful to have a beetle to check across the clearing first to see if there's anyone hanging around over there. And of course, you can move up to the compound at any point from this forest. It's really up to you. There's quite a bit of cover leading up to it anywhere back here. Just be wary of players more towards the Port Rico side. While this route avoids the majority of the traditional sight lines around the compound, There is occasionally an extraction spot right in that clearing over there, so you will have to be wary of players sitting in the tree line nearby. If that extraction isn't there, however, this is almost always pretty safe. Just be wary of sound traps as you cross along this area. There are often immolators in the road, and armoreds along the embankment, and of course the usual grunt spawns along the bushes. As you approach port, along this bridge here on the railing on the right side, there's often, I call them crow spawns. Apparently Crytek says they're ravens, but I never heard anyone call them ravens outside of Crytek. But I prefer to go under, as it avoids that sound trap and a lot of sightlines. This pathing here is designed to avoid bridge trolls and having to cross all the open water in front of port. That being said, these couple of islands over here are very common spots for campers, so there's lots of bushes to hide in. So this will at least allow you to take anybody sitting over here off guard, but if you have a beetle with you, I highly recommend scouting around the area first before you cross the water. If you are worried about campers being over here, one thing I suggest is you could always head from the east side of port using the low ground to head south, and then use the Darrow to Alice route, heading of course instead to Darrow along the embankment, which you'll see here shortly, to avoid this area completely. We're using the same starting point as the port to Darrow route. However, we're just going to continue through the forest until we reach the end of the tree line before crossing. A quick note about this pathing here. If there is a fight happening north of Reynard, especially at the logs just across the water here, I recommend instead using the end of the port to Darrow pathing, except instead of heading into Darrow, obviously, you would cross the river right over there from cover into the Reynard compound. When heading from Darrow to Reynard, however, I recommend using the beginning of the Darrow to Lockbay route, which will be coming up here shortly, to avoid campers on that bridge. These options are designed to not only avoid the large clearing in between Darrow and Alice, that's all just open ground, but also, more importantly, the most notorious stretch of forest in the entire game. It is the most infamous camping spot, and you could honestly confirm another 11 burned bodies besides yourself and still somehow find a bush with a Romero player in it, in this forest. I don't know how that happens, but just don't go through it. It's difficult even to scout with a beetle because some of the foliage is so thick that you could pass right by somebody with it and not know. So this is down the embankment in front of Port Riker. From this, you'll have to be careful if Port Riker is in play here, but if not, this should be relatively safe. Obviously, don't sprint like I'm doing, or you're inviting someone to run out of the forest after you. So long as you walk along, people should not hear you down there as you cross. You can also, if you're scared about skirting around the edges of it, you can continue along the embankment until you cross near this bridge. You'll of course have to watch for people approaching from the other side of the bridge, as it's a slight exposed spot along here. But continue along the next embankment, and this will allow you to stay in cover all the way up to the compound. A quick note here, I do have the forest route marked as an option on the map. After all, it is very good cover between the two compounds. So if you're confident that no one's in there, it's great for cover, but again, it's so notorious that I don't recommend it a vast majority of the time. For the Darrow to Lockbay route, I actually recommend using this as well for the previous pathing for Darrow to Alice if Port Ricoeur happens to be in play and is a threat. Simply follow this down until you reach the bridge in between Lockbay and Alice, and cross under it to get into Alice itself. The spot up here at the end of the tree line is great for taking shots towards Lockbay with rifles. Be careful though if you station up here to do so, as the approach towards Lockbay is very dangerous. There's a lot of sightlines that look at it if you leave the tree line. And if you stay there for too long, if you have a team come up behind you, you're not going to have many places to go. So take a handful of shots from here if you would like, but be sure to change positions very quickly. Obviously try not to take fall damage like I did here, but what I'd like to say is that while there is a decent amount of cover directly in between Reynard and Alain, it is a rather high traffic area if the compounds happen to be in play, and a lot of veteran players will expect players to go from point A to point B in that area. So this route is designed to go around that high traffic location while still maintaining very solid cover. You'll have to be careful with this route if Alain is in play, or you suspect a team to be at Alain, as the compound has a lot of sightlines on this path. But as far as Reynard is concerned, it's very, very safe if Alain is not in play. That being said, I will show another route later that uses part of the Blanchette to Alain pathing to also get around to Reynard, which can be helpful if there are multiple teams in the area. For the Blanchette to Alain pathing, when heading west into the forest, I highly recommend leaving from the southern end of Blanchette whenever possible to minimize exposure from this clearing here, as well as avoid a lot of potential AI spawns, as there's often many hives and immolators down this hill. We're using this deep forest route to avoid a lot of sightlines from teams approaching from either Reynard or Darrow, as well as to avoid some sightlines from the Alain compound, as people waiting inside will often be looking out the windows to the exit of this forest. This spot right here is another water crossing that does not incur movement penalty if you go across the right stretch, and be very careful as you get into these mounds back here, as teams often like to sit in the bushes back here aiming at the compound. So approach quietly and keep your eyes peeled, and you should be just fine. Picking right up where we left off from the Blanchette to Alain pathing, this is the other route I was talking about earlier, where you basically just continue around the back of the forest here until you reach a bridge that allows you to get into the tree line west of Reynard, where you can push up from relative safety. While I'm not a big fan of crossing bridges most of the time, this is way over in the corner of the map, and unless you have some fights going on at Alain for some reason, there's almost never going to be anybody watching this spot. One of the other things to watch out for in this area is there's sometimes an extraction up the road here. If that happens to be present at this location, maybe consider cutting through the swamp a little bit earlier to avoid potential extraction campers. For the Alain to Blanchette pathing here, it's essentially the same route as the Blanchette to Reynard pathing. That being said, I mostly recommend using it strictly to head from Alain to Blanchette. You can use it the other way in relative safety a lot of the time, but it's a little bit riskier going the other way should Alain be active. This is mainly designed to avoid the two bridges that cross out into the open in between Blanchette and Alain. Now, we'll discuss some of the more straightforward routes that don't really need a visual showcase. That being said, I will show a few screenshots. Afterward, I will also talk about the risks when traveling to or around Catfish, Lockbay, Healing Waters, and Port Ricoeur. Starting with the Cypress to Blanchette pathing, this route is very straightforward in that you simply head into the tree line west of Cypress and follow it north until you reach Blanchette, avoiding sightlines from the swamp and the Blanchette Tower while doing so. Where the arrow is pointing on this map, you'll run into this spot here, where you have to cross some water. If you follow the lily pads across, the water is shallow enough here that it won't incur a movement penalty. Next up is this weird little path that leads from Davant to the corner of the map south of Cypress. Should the extraction boat be out in the water just down the ramp from the Cypress compound, from this spot, you should be able to see the back of the extraction boat while staying out of darksight range, making it a powerful spot for a sniper. I don't recommend approaching Cypress from here, obviously, but I thought the spot deserved a mention. For the Davant to Slaughterhouse route, or vice versa, you'll simply follow the foliage around the estuary until you reach the tree line just south of Slaughterhouse, or the tree line south of Davant should you be heading the other way. I highly recommend using a beetle here to scout ahead, as getting caught out in the estuary will almost surely be a death sentence. Unfortunately, there really isn't another decent path between the two compounds, with everything else being completely open space. The cornfield west of Slaughterhouse also doesn't provide great protection, as getting to it is risky, and a hunter sitting in the White House next to the main Slaughterhouse barn, which is a very common defensive point, will easily pick you off as you travel through there. Slaughter to Healing is simply following the tree line until you can see this shed here, as it is the closest point when coming from this direction, from cover to compound. We'll talk more about why the area around Healing Waters is insanely dangerous here shortly. The path between Healing and Pitching is a straight line across the road heading into the tree line. The forest east of Pitching is actually the closest point of cover around the entirety of the Healing Waters compound. Lastly, when heading from Chapel to Alice, you'll head into the forest east of Chapel, then follow the tree line around until you are using the same pathing as the Stillwater to Alice clip. Remember those risky compounds I mentioned earlier. When it comes to approaching Catfish, Healing Waters, Lockbay, or Port Ricoeur, my recommendation is simply don't, unless you absolutely have to. I know that sounds like a bold claim, so let me explain myself, with the caveat, of course, that this is a suggestion for the optimal playstyle. If it's more fun for you to run in and take the risk, then prioritize what is fun for you. Each of the compounds I mentioned has a heavily favored defensive advantage, as there's little to no cover when advancing on them. Catfish and Port Ricoeur are completely surrounded by water, and all of the compounds have completely open sight lines leading up to them, making anyone pushing in easy pickings for long ammo scoped in on the area. Between potential defenders and long ammo players hiding in the surrounding area, tactically, it simply makes no sense to approach these compounds. There is a slight exception here for Healing Waters. If you can get within the walls safely, there is a lot of cover to utilize in the compound. For Healing Waters specifically, I would wait until there's fighting, then try to get inside the walls or use a beetle to see if a particular entrance is free of players holding angles. The best way to handle these areas, if they happen to be banished targets, is to either rotate around them while taking long-range shots, or to see where the nearest extractions are located and wait outside of darksight range at a nearby compound that allows you to cut off a bounty team in a location that is safer for you to fight in. If you have some sort of close-range loadout that does not permit for fighting at range, I've shown the approaches that have the lowest risk throughout the video, except for this one leading to Catfish. While it is still vulnerable to teams in the surrounding area, it has the least amount of sightlines on it and allows for quick access underneath the compound, with only a brief window of exposure to any potential defenders. Coming soon on the channel, I'm almost done with the video on what I call the everything loadout, which I think right now, at least in my opinion, is the best possible solo loadout you can bring into the Bayou, as it allows you to operate at every possible range, which allows for immense versatility in many different situations. I also, of course, have the other two pathing guides on the way for Lawson Delta and DeSalle, as well as some other projects that I have yet to announce on the back burner that will probably be in between these videos I've already listed out here, so look forward to those. Of course, as always, everyone is welcome to come ask me questions about this video or any of my other videos when I am live Mondays, Wednesdays, and Fridays at 8 p.m. MST. Until then, good hunting in the Bayou, everyone, and I'll see you all on the next one.